Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski.
Today we're in Texas with a native Pennsylvanian born not far from where I was born, somebody whose name you might recognize. He's known as Wish. It's Mike Wischnia in Austin, Texas today, running for 6 decades. We'll catch up with his story. Welcome today on the
Thank you.
podcast,
Nice
Wish.
to hear.
Wish, let's start with your origin story as an athlete and as a runner, because you started out really early as a runner before it was chic or part of the culture. How did you start out as a sports?
We lived in Connecticut. After we moved from Pennsylvania, we moved to Connecticut, and I went to a very small elementary school that didn't have a cafeteria. And so kids would go home at lunch in a town called Belltown, Connecticut. It was Belltown School. I lived about a mile and a half away from the school. I really don't know why, but I just started running back and forth to school. When I was in third grade, I was like 8 or 9. In between my house and the school were these woods with trails and stuff. It just became the center of my day. As I got, older, when I was in like fifth and sixth grade, the teachers knew what I was doing. As soon as the clock hit noon, I would just burst out of the classroom and I would time myself. And running wasn't very known it just wasn't a recreational sport. And I didn't really know what I was doing or anything like that. As I got older, like in sixth and seventh grade, I was probably pretty fit. I started entering a few races and stuff like that in junior high. And because kids weren't running and I would win most of them. It just was really, it became the highlight of my day and still is 65, 70 years later.
That's great.
Yeah, I've always been doing it.
Well, what about those early days running through the trails, not so much on the roads at
Yeah.
first? When did you start to see other people? When did the jogging thing hit that you saw other people running and people said, "Oh, there's that guy that runs, there's that kid"?
They all knew me as the kid that ran because I'd be running through the winter in Connecticut to get to my friend's house because my parents weren't driving me around. And I ran cross country in high school and I was pretty good, I guess. It wasn't great, but the town I lived in only had one road race a year. And it was really ironic. It was the Bloomingdale's 15K. I didn't know how far 15K was. I had no idea. I had never run in a road race. And the irony of it is, Amby Burfoot, who was Boston Marathon champion, who was also from Connecticut, came down to the town I lived in to run the race. I thought, wow, okay. And I knew who he was. And
Late 60s.
I was 68 or 69. And my father said, just stay with this guy. He probably knows what he's doing. I watched him warm up and I didn't even know how to warm. I didn't know anything about warm ups. And I was too intimidated to even talk to him or anything like that. There were probably only 50 people in the race. The gun went off and tried staying with him. I lasted probably a mile, if that. The irony, of course, was he became one of my best friends and we worked together for 25 years. And he was really an inspiration to me.
Let me ask you about the picture of what was going on there for equipment. You were on a cross country team.
Yeah.
Did you have a coach who knew anything? Did you have equipment?
No, I also went to a very small high school. They had a cross country team, but I was the only guy on the team. And then my senior year, another guy was on the team. It was all boys. A teacher would drive us to the races and he'd be standing around smoking cigarettes and we would wear like basketball singlets, jerseys that had the school name on it. I did pretty well, but it was just so unusual. And one of the reasons I liked running in high school was it got me out of football practice. They would let me take 1 or 2 days off from football practice to go run around the school for 5 or 6 miles. I just was always drawn to it. I'm not even sure what many examples. I didn't know anybody who ran. My father ran a little bit, but I didn't know what I was doing. I would just run. I did pretty well, but it was a small situation, small pool of people.
What about spring sports?
My primary sport was baseball. I always loved baseball, and I was the captain of the baseball team. But I also ran track in the spring, going back and forth between the two. It was a very small school, and I just did multiple things. I was a good baseball player. I was never big enough or anything to really make it. And running was just something that I did, and I didn't know anything about it. There weren't any books that I was aware of. Runner's World didn't even, I guess Runner's World existed. But I wasn't aware of it. And
How'd you know who Amby Burfoot was?
from that race, the first race I ran, I remember reading about a guy from Connecticut winning the Boston Marathon in 1968. There was so many ironies involved in our relationship because when I first started working for Runner's World in 1977, I picked up a Joe Henderson book, Long Slow Distance Solution. In the book, there was this quote from Amby about why he ran. And it just really struck a nerve with me. It was just so cosmic. And I called him up. I said, "Hey, what's up? What are you doing?" He was teaching at the time. I said, "Do you write?" Because we were looking for writers. And he said, "I've never really written anything." I said, "Well, would you like to try? Would you want to do this?" And he did. And we were partners for 25 years. We worked together very closely. And he is a great person.
I just want to get one more
Yeah.
idea of your high school
Yeah.
experience. Team sports, obviously, baseball's important to your captain. Did you have the leadership gene or behavior and attitude? And how important was competition to you in this small
Well,
environment?
I've always been a really super competitive person. I still am. In Little League and Babe Ruth League and all that kind of stuff, I would scratch and claw. I didn't have any power, but I had really good speed. I had a good glove and I knew how to get on base. And competition to me was, just at the root of who I was. And I was competitive professionally and as a writer and an editor. I was really competitive as an athlete. I couldn't beat guys who were really good.
Yeah, there's something that's in common with people, though, especially that there's everybody's on a different part of that continuum
Right.
for how important, how does competition feed your ability to get up every morning and stay in shape. We'll talk about how that idea of competition in your professional life and that you ended up competing really well, successfully later in life and being able to be competitive in running in that sport, right?
I competed. I didn't retire from racing until I was 66. My last race was at the Houston Marathon, and I competed right up until then. I don't race anymore. I don't run any races, but I still run every day. And I don't compete in running, but I compete in golf. I compete in swimming, but just not in running. The competition in running was, I loved it. I just totally loved it. Even when I was older, here in Austin, we have so many races. It's like a bowling league. There's 4 or 5 races every weekend. And there was a core group of about 6 or 7 of us older runners who were always competitive for age groups and stuff. And it really fueled it. I just always loved it. Always been a competitive person, I guess.
Well, you've told the story of finding out how far Amby Burfoot was training. How about
Yeah.
your running? When did you start running mileage that was normal for a runner? What'd you do in high school?
The funny story about Amby and his mileage before the race in Connecticut that I was talking about, my first race, there was a story about him in the newspaper saying that Amby Burfoot, the Boston Marathon champion, was going to run this race. And it said he ran as much as 140 miles a week. And I thought the newspaper had gotten it wrong because nobody could run 140 miles a week. Of course, he ran up to 180. But my mileage, I don't even know what it was. It was probably about 25 or 30 miles a week. I never kept training logs back then or anything like that. So I didn't really train. I was just running the way I felt and then just being outside. There was a reservoir near our school and running around the reservoir. And it was just a joyful thing for me. It's just been ingrained in me forever. My mileage, obviously, as I got better and got into marathons and stuff like that, which
By the time you're in high school and graduating, running had made it to TV. We've had some serious American success in the Olympics. Was
yeah,
that on your radar? Were you a fan of that stuff?
huge, huge. I have absolutely clear memories of seeing Herb Elliott on TV win the 1960 1500 meters. And to me, he was God. In fact, I lived with his family for a year in Australia. I worked for Herb, and he was God. And Bill Dillinger finishing second or third in the 5,000. I got to know Bill really well. I was his ghostwriter. And then Billy Mills was the epitome of American distance running in 1964. And I really loved track, even though I didn't know that much about it. It was on TV. They had indoor meets on TV and the Olympics. I lived for the Olympics. I just lived for the Olympics and still do. I was lucky enough to cover quite a few Olympics. But track, it just wasn't a mainstream thing until I don't even know if it still is now. I just always loved it. I remember Jim Beatty breaking the 4-minute mile barrier on an indoor track. And I thought that was awesome. And it was cool because I lived my dreams by getting to know and meet all these people much later on, of course.
Yeah, you've interacted with people, you've run with them, you've
Yeah.
written about them, you've
Yeah.
watched them, you've attended. You're really a good connector point for people who know you are 1 or 2 degrees of separation from pretty
Like
much
Stella.
everybody.
Yeah.
Uh,
I was really able to live my dreams, running with some of the greatest runners. I ran with Salazar, Di Costello, Steve Scott, virtually everybody, Lynn Williams, Herb Elliott. When I lived with Herb's family in Perth, I was setting up an Australian edition of Runners in 1980, and I lived with Herb's family, and we'd start every morning with a run through the bush. You'd see these huge kangaroos waking up, and it was just cosmic to get to know people like that who are such, forget the running ability. They were just great people. And I was really fortunate to have known so many people like that.
I want to get back to and progress through your life from
Yeah.
high school to college. But
Yeah.
first, I just want to hit that 1980, the US boycotted.
Yeah.
What was the buzz in Australia then with the Olympics boycott?
Boy, it was mixed. It was really mixed. When I was in Perth, which is where Herb lived, Rob Di Costella is not from Perth. He's from Melbourne, but he was living in Perth and training in Perth. And the Australian athletes wanted to go to the Olympics. And eventually they did. One of their biggest supporters was Herb. I don't know if he was on the Australian Olympic Committee. I can't recall, but he was supporting them going to the Olympics. And that was really helpful to me to meet all these guys like Deke. And I think they had mixed feelings. I don't really remember. The American athletes were just furious. They were robbed of their chance to go to the Olympics. I was very close with Steve Scott, who was really at the height of his power. To deprive him of that chance to run in the Olympics was really brutal for him.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
was
I was thinking, did you know Craig Burgeon well?
very well. Yeah.
To me, he's another guy that was about peaking in 1980 and
Yes.
podium bound.
We did have the Olympic trials in 1980 in Eugene, and our team would have been really strong. Mary Decker was at the height, Virgin, Centrowitz, Steve Scott, Henry Marsh. All these guys were just really great. And you only have really one shot, I think. And they all ran in subsequent Olympics, but I think their time had passed.
Yeah.
So it was tough.
Yeah, a teammate of mine from IUP did make the 84 team into decathlon, but the same thing.
Mhm.
He didn't do so good in the 80 trials, just
Who was
happened
that?
to get injured. Jim Wooding.
Oh, okay.
He finished 7th in LA and he won, I think he won the nationals 81, 82, but so many people around that period. Let's go. Let's finish off. I want to just get an idea of your psyche here. You were a small town athlete, competitive, and you went far away to college. What were you thinking in terms of going to college? What you want to do was, were you hoping to play any sports, and what happened next?
I went to Arizona State and I wanted to play baseball. I arrived at Arizona State in the summer and I went to the coach and I said, "Can I try out for the team?" He said, "Yeah, you can try out." And it was a joke. I had never come close to half the team signed major league contracts.
Yeah.
So I had no chance at all. But
Why'd you pick Arizona State?
because I wanted to get into sports writing, I wanted to work for a newspaper. I wanted to become a sports writer. That was my love. And I had a lot of writing ability even at an early age. When I got to Tempe, I don't know why or how, but I went right to the newspaper in Phoenix, the Arizona Republic, which was this huge statewide paper. I went to the sports editor when I was like 18. I said, "Can I get a job here next summer?" And the guy said, "You can start tomorrow if you want." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." So I started working at the newspaper when I was 18. I found that I really loved it and I had an ability in it to write and to write quickly. When you work at a newspaper, you have to write really fast. I found I had an ability to do that. I enjoyed it and I loved sports. That's what I did. I worked at the newspaper all my years in college, and the newspaper actually even paid for my college. So it was really great.
What sports were you covering mainly there?
As a kid, it was high school sports. The Arizona Republic is a newspaper for the entire state. There would be like 100 football games every Friday night, and we'd have to not cover every game. We didn't obviously do that. The kids would call in reports. We'd have to write little stories about the games, and you had 5 minutes to write a story. Eventually, I covered basketball, Phoenix Suns, baseball, everything, ASU football. It was great. It was a great training experience.
Then in the 70s, as a journalist, you're going to be reading a lot too.
Mhm.
And to study. What sports publications were you reading by the time you graduated?
Well, I read Sports Illustrated probably from the time I could read. That really resonated with me. After I left the Arizona Republic, I actually went to work for a magazine called Sport Magazine, which was a monthly
Oh, yeah.
sports. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've been reading that since I was 15. I went to work for them and I just always loved sports. It was the only thing I could really relate to. I couldn't relate to politics or economics or any of that stuff. I got to travel. It's funny. My goal in college was to travel and to get somebody else to pay for it. In that respect, I met my goal like, because I
Where
got all over the world.
is this something that you shared with your family? This kind of wanting to see the world thing? Where'd that
Um,
come from?
I don't know. I don't know where it came from. When I was at ASU, I'd go on football trips. It was really exciting to go on the road and stuff like that. And I knew that's what I wanted to do intuitively, I think. Like Runner's World, we covered so many Olympics and Ambien. I had so many world championships. We got to go all over the world and it was a dream, really.
Let's talk about the nature of the sport and the nature of the athletes in those mid 70s as you
Yeah.
were hitting runner's world. What was going on in terms of any kind of controversies, drugs, money? Do you remember the nature of the world? And you're coming in as a new guy, a professional, but not a known runner. Did you have some hurdles to clear to get some of these athletes to open up to you?
Oh, you bet. Yeah, totally. A lot of runners are very quiet people, not used to talking in public. Some athletes just didn't even want to talk. They didn't want to be misquoted. They didn't want anything controversial. And other athletes, of course, Steve Scott, who was really one of my closest friends, was like an open book. Alberto Salazar was like an open book. We were really good friends. I always had to caution Alberto when I was doing an interview with him. I said, "Listen, dude, we're doing an interview now. Don't tell me anything you don't want me to print because I'll print anything." And Alberto, I got in trouble after I believe it was the Was the 1981 Boston Marathon, was that the Duel in the Sun?
Yeah, 81, 82.
I can't remember the
Yeah,
year,
yeah.
but, Amby did an interview with Dick
Beardsley.
Beardsley, who actually used to live in Austin. Amby did an interview with Dick Beardsley, and I did an interview with Alberto. We combined the two, and Alberto said some really outrageous things that he regretted saying in it, and he expected me to protect him a little bit, and I don't know, it didn't really interfere.
You're selling magazines, yeah.
Yeah, well, it didn't really
With that
interfere
hat.
with the friendship.
Yeah.
But, like, back then, in the early '80s, Alberto wouldn't talk to the media. He was a very introverted guy. He just didn't wanna talk to the media, and he would call me, and I became his mouthpiece a little bit, and it was not a comfortable situation for me.
Yeah,
But
I don't know him. I have friends and people who have run with him, and they said he was a guy who wasn't always jumping in to be the middle of the crowd.
yeah,
Even in training runs, they would say he'd run. He wouldn't necessarily join in the conversations on some of the runs. He'd be running his thing. Yeah.
he's also deeply religious, and I am not, and he was very conservative even back then, and I am not. But we just always got along really well. I know all the stuff that's come out about him since then. Part of it's squared with the guy I know, and part of it didn't square with the guy I know. So I've never really defended him, but I certainly never would accuse him of anything. He's a great person. He's a
Yeah.
great person to his family, to his kids, and to his wife and to his friends. I love the guy.
Your ability to have those relationships with all these people that are quite different psychologically or
Yeah.
so philosophically from you reflects well on you. And I can see how that helps you get to open the doors and things. Let's talk about your impressions and just some reflections on from 1977 on. That's a good period to see the tidal wave with Pre and everybody else and a lot of the names getting the money to come to how these athletes are going to be able to have the trust funds to fund their careers. What was going on that you witnessed? And what was the office talk at Runner's World when you guys would say, hey, what you think?
It was a little later than 77, more like 79 and 80. One of my good friends is Don Cardon, and Don used to write for us. And Don once told me a story. He was running in the US Track Nationals, I think it was, and I don't remember where it was. And he ended up having to sleep in somebody's closet on the floor, and he piled up their clothes to make a bed. And that was the way track athletes were treated back then. There was no professionalism. Some guys, very few guys, got under the table money, very few, Shorter and Rogers, but not many. In 1981, at the Cascade Runoff in Portland, all the prominent road runners got together and said, "This is crap." They banded together. Anna Dame was one of them. And they put their foot down, and money started to trickle into the sport only for a few people. It was tough. I go interview guys, do stories on people. I was doing a story once on Steve Scott, and he was sleeping on somebody's floor. And other countries subsidized their athletes. The United States didn't. It was really disheartening. But once professionalism started to come into the sport, then it spread to other sports. Now the Olympics is completely open, and that's the way it should be. Oh,
Okay, let's talk about the first Olympics that you traveled to cover
no,
professional.
that's okay. The first Olympics I traveled to was I went to Russia. I went to Moscow in 1980, and that was a night. That wasn't a night. It was. I got in a lot of trouble there. Amby was supposed to go. Amby and I were going, and his visa wasn't approved for some odd reason. My last name is Russian, and my visa was approved. I went to Moscow, and there were only a handful of Americans there, and American journalists there. What happened to me was two things. One of the first days that I was there, we're staying in this huge hotel right by the Kremlin where all the press was. Some guy said, "You want to go for a run?" It was right along the Moscow River. I said, "Yeah, sure." So I met him outside. It started to drizzle or rain. So I went back to my room to get a rain jacket, and there was a guy going through all my stuff. Yeah, I used to travel with a lot of vitamins and keeps healthy and stuff. And he was going through everything. I said, "What the heck? What's this?" I'll just sit, take a seat. And so that was that. At the Olympics, track doesn't start for about 10 days usually at the Olympics. So I was covering basketball for Associated Press just as a favor, to give me something to do at night. I was covering like Austria against Slovenia or something like that.
Right.
I covered this game and I go back to the AP and the guy says, "Hey, so what's going on?" I said, "Oh man, there's this guy in my room." And he did a big story about harassment of Americans in Russia. And it was in all the newspapers. And my parents just freaked out. It was really weird. We were followed and we were targeted. And once the track started, the track stadium was about, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles away from our hotel. They have morning sessions and night sessions. And at one of the morning sessions, Kenny Moore from Sports Illustrated was there. And I knew Kenny. And I said, "You want to run back to the hotel?" And he said, "Yeah, okay, cool." So we gave our stuff to one of our colleagues. We were running back to the hotel along the Moscow River, which is right where the Kremlin is, and our hotel was right next to it, Red Square and everything. On this huge avenue was closed to traffic during the Olympics, other than like official Olympic traffic. So we're running along the river and we could see our hotel like maybe a quarter mile in distance, and there was no traffic on the road. So we just cut across the road. These soldiers just, they didn't arrest us, but they hauled us in. We're going, we're Americans. We got our press badges. Give me a break. And they took us to this room at the hotel. And I'm like, "What are you guys, crazy?" And Kenny Moore goes, "Give me the American embassy." But he gets the American embassy, some embassy official down there. And I said, and we'd been there for 3 or 4 hours. And I said to the American embassy official, I said, "Get up, we jaywalk. What are they going to do? Shoot us?" And they go, "They might."
So you want to see the world, Wish?
Yeah, they might. And I thought, wow, okay. So, I mean, they didn't shoot us, but I got into a lot of trouble in Moscow. It was not a pleasant experience. I lost a lot of weight because I couldn't eat the food. The track wasn't all that interesting because there weren't any Americans there. And it was a good experience, but it was not one of the more memorable Olympics I've been to.
You were keen to go to which Olympics did you cover next in person?
I covered everyone from 80 up until through Atlanta, 80, 84, 88 in Seoul,
Okay.
Barcelona, and then Atlanta. That was it.
All right.
Yeah. Barcelona
Well,
was the greatest.
what was it about Barcelona? Here's one thing I remember about Barcelona. I think I was living in Egypt then, and the opening ceremonies came.
Oh,
It was spectacular.
unbelievable.
And I got up and said, everybody in the world's going to have to agree that was spectacular. And the headlines on one of the newspapers said, "What a crap show. What are they
Really?
wasting?" Yeah. And I thought, I couldn't find a second opinion that agreed with that guy. It was spectacular, the opening and everything. So what was it like? I went to the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, but what was it like in Barcelona? What made it so good?
It was awesome. I'm a sucker for opening ceremonies. I love them, other than the one in Moscow. I thought Barcelona was just incredible. It was just so exciting. The people of Barcelona were so welcoming to us. I was actually working for NBC Sports and Runner's World at the time. So I was doing double duty. The Olympics were just awesome in so many respects. Like all Olympics, they're in July or August, and it's so hot there. And the athletes were just dying. The marathons in Barcelona were insane. I may be wrong, but I think they started at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And you had to finish up a mountain
Straight off.
this week. One of the most memorable things to me of that Olympics was covering the women's marathon. I wasn't on air or anything. I was one of those guys behind the scenes, but I was in the studio with the announcers, I could see Lorraine Moeller moving up a little bit. And Lorraine was a good friend of mine. I loved Lorraine. I still do. So she moves into second or third place going up the mountain. And her coach was Ron Dawes, and he was her ex-husband. And he had just died that week, if I remember correctly. And I remember saying to the NBC commentator, "Oh my God," through the headphones, I said, "Her ex-husband just died this week. I know she's inspired to run a great marathon because of him." And the announcer goes, "Was it an amicable divorce?" I said, "No, he's dead." And he said, "Well, I can't use it unless it was amicable." I go, "Whatever." But it was really a memorable Olympics for me in just so many respects. It was really terrific.
That's good. I interviewed Lorraine. We talked a lot about that race
Oh, it was awesome.
and about her training,
Yeah.
about finishing every one of her workouts uphill in a couple pairs of sweats to get ready for the heat. She was really well prepared and really
Well,
had
with Lorraine, the worse the conditions were, the better she ran. Mentally, she was one of the strongest runners I've ever known. She was just there. And conditions just didn't matter to her. She just was going to do it. I think she finished third.
third. She got third.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was just really memorable to me. I just loved it.
Let me ask you about the run of Runners World while you were there.
Mhm.
Back in 1977, a couple years before that, they had been, I don't know what situation the magazine was in. You could buy a lifetime subscription.
That's right. $100.
They did a pretty good job for a long time of tracking people down and getting them.
Yep.
What was the arc of the magazine's life and editorial and coverage for your 26, 27 years there?
It changed drastically. When I started working for Runner's World, it was in Mountain View, California, in the Bay Area, right near San Jose. It was started and owned by Bob Anderson, who had started the magazine when he was in high school in Kansas because there wasn't any running information and he was a pretty good runner. It wasn't a one-man operation, but his company had grown to include other magazines, other sports magazines. And he was, how shall I put it? He was a different person to work for. He was pretty demanding. He wasn't the cuddliest person I've ever met, just basically the opposite. In 1985, he got divorced from his wife, Rita Anderson, who also worked at the magazine. And because of the divorce, he had to sell the magazine to pay the settlement. So he sold the magazine to Rodale Press in Pennsylvania. Fortunately, it was a blessing of my life that I was chosen to go back to Pennsylvania to continue working for Runners. There were only, I don't know, 4 or 5 of us who did. Rodale Press was like the polar opposite of Runners World before under Bob Anderson. Rodale Press was owned and operated by a guy, Bob Rodale, who was one of the nicest, sweetest, smartest people I've ever met. It was really interesting. One of our first days in Pennsylvania, we were having this big meeting. Bob Rodale was a very quiet man. Actually, he was an Olympian in shooting, skate shooting. So he knew. And we were having this big meeting about increasing our circulation or all this kind of business stuff. And this man, Bob Rodale, walks into our meeting and he's just sitting there, not saying anything. And we all knew he was there, obviously. And so everybody's talking. And finally he goes, "I don't care about any of that stuff. I don't care about circulation. I don't care about revenue. All I want you guys to do is build a community. I want you to build a running community. Focus on that." And we thought, oh my God, this guy's great. And we all loved him. And it was just a great experience. Rodale owned the magazine for, 25 years. It was really terrific. Moving from the Bay Area to rural Pennsylvania was also really great. It was nice.
Let's swing it back to your running then.
Yeah.
What age were you when you went back to Pennsylvania? What was going on with you in racing? And
What happened to me was in coming in the Bay Area, there were so many races and there were so many great runners. I knew so many Olympians. I lived in Palo Alto. And there were probably like 6 or 7 Olympians who lived there. Duncan McDonald, Don Cardon, all these great guys. And we moved to rural Pennsylvania. It wasn't exactly a running capital or anything like that, but there were really good races and there were great places to run along like the rivers and the trails and everything. It was terrific for me because I started getting into high mileage, mainly doing long runs with Amby. Amby taught me everything I knew about running, and I wasn't the only one. I remember, absolutely true story. In about 82 or 83, I was at a race in Denver, Colorado, and I was doing a race clinic, pre-race clinic with Bill Rogers and Jim Fix. And I said to Bill very facetiously, because I knew Bill really well. I said to him facetiously, is it true you learned everything about running from Amby Burfoot? They were roommates in college. And he goes, yeah, everything I know about running, I learned from Amby. And he was serious. And I was the same way, of course, really different results. Yes. Doing long runs with Amby was just like this education. And we'd done so many long runs together. And here was this great runner who never, ever talked about himself. He never said, oh, yeah, man, when I won the Boston Marathon, oh, I kicked it. This guy never talked about himself. But I just learned how to pace myself better and how to I didn't know what I was doing. I was running long runs as hard as I was doing races. And he'd be running like 7:30 pace. Right. I just learned a lot from him. And running in Pennsylvania was just great. I got to run in races all over the country. We would go to cover races or I'd get invited to races and stuff. It was really fun. And I loved it.
Let's talk about when you start collecting higher medals and better finishing positions. As you got older, we talked about that maybe you didn't sustain the injuries through your life because you weren't doing the high mileage that some early competitive athletes did. When was it that you were getting towards the finish line first in some of these races and approaching them differently then? Did it change in you when, hey, I got to be really in top form. I might be competitive here.
What changed in me was the realization that as I was getting older, I was getting better. Most in my 20s and 30s, I didn't ran. It wasn't like I drank and then smoked dope, everything. It just really wasn't that much of but I started winning my age group in races. I thought, wow, okay, that's cool. And as I got older, I got in better shape. I got into yoga and preventive. I've always been a swimmer. My swimming background always helped me. It was really interesting. In 1990, I went to New Zealand and I did a story about this man who, when he was 65 years old, ran a 2:35 marathon. Yes. He was a sheep farmer. And I thought, wow, this guy is still fit as can be. He's better than when he's in his 20s. And I wanted to be like that. And I don't know if running became more important to me, but I just learned how to run better. Had better shoes. I wasn't getting injured. I was running on trails, soft trails, rather than highly cambered roads and stuff. And because of Amby, I really started to focus on marathons and half marathons. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the training more than I enjoyed the races. I enjoyed racing, but I loved training. People were always complaining about doing long runs and stuff. I was going, it's the highlight of my week. When I moved to Austin about 20 years ago, I joined a training group here in town, and people were always going, oh man, we got to do 20 miles Saturday. I don't know if I could do that. Oh man, I'm going, it was like a holiday for me. I loved it. And I honestly can say I've never, I've, I don't know, I've never had a run, which I hated when I was not injured. If I was injured, that was sometimes tough, but I don't know. Always had a good attitude about it. At Runner's World in Pennsylvania, we all ran, not all of us, but a lot of us would run together at lunch. And we had a 6-mile trail right near our offices. And it was just great. It was camaraderie, almost like teamwork. And we didn't have like petty jealousies among the guys and stuff like that. It was really good.
Sounds great. What town were you in
In
Pennsylvania?
Pennsylvania? It was a little, Runner's World was in a little town called Emmaus, Pennsylvania,
I
which
know it.
is near Allentown and Bethlehem. It was really great. My kids were born there and it was all good. It was really good.
Everything's positive, and you had some frank things to say about your friend, Mr. Salazar. Is there anybody else who surprised you, who you knew from running, and when you got to meet them, you just an incongruence, and this is the athlete, the person, and the real person.
There were, I can honestly say there have only been a couple of runners that I've known and interacted with who I didn't like. And there were two, Lynn Jennings and I just never got along. I was covering the World Cross Country Championships once in Auckland, New Zealand. And I think she finished second or third. And she'd go, I'm after the race. She goes, I was injured. I said, oh, okay. She said, well, don't write that. And I said, well, tell me what to write.
Yeah.
And she and I just never got along. And she wasn't too fond of me and I wasn't too fond of her. And Lisa Martin and I didn't get along very well. I did a big story on her and she hated it, which was fine. And I also didn't get along very well with Mary Petra.
That, with all due respect, that might not be the smallest club.
Some of my favorite runners were Canadians. Lynn Williams and Paul Williams are two of my favorite runners. Brian Maxwell was from Toronto. The late Brian Maxwell was a great guy. Don Howison, I think he's from BC, but he's from Toronto. Great guy. I always liked the Australians and the Canadians' attitude about running. I learned so much from like Deke. Deke was like, if you start a race, you have no excuse. If you're hurt and you don't start the race, that's fine. But if you start a race, that's it. You have to finish the race and you have no excuse whatsoever. And I thought their attitude was just really great. A lot of Americans were always coming up with maybe legitimate excuses, but excuses and why they didn't run well. And
Yeah, I know you've said that you have just a handful of DNFs, and that was important to you. Now I understand why a little bit.
I do remember dropping out of one race. I hurt my foot. And I dropped out of an Austin marathon once. I've only dropped out of 2 or 3 races in my life. I've finished pretty much everything. And in Texas, sometimes it's pretty darn hard because it can get really hot here.
Yeah. Yeah, you've been down under Australia, New Zealand, and while everybody's unique, that they do have a culture of hitting the pub after the runs too.
One of the other famous runners I worked for was Rod Dixon. And Rod Dixon's motto was work like a dog, drink like a fish. And when I was in Perth and I was running with Deke's group, after every run, we'd end up at a pub and it was fun. It was just really fun. It was terrific. Their attitude about running was just different than ours. It wasn't as serious. It wasn't life or death. And I really appreciated that.
Probably was while they were in the race, but
oh, they were
immediately
competitive as
afterwards.
hell. Yeah, but like Alberto in the early 80s, if he had a bad workout, he would go into a funk and Deke would just roll off his back. The difference between the Australian and New Zealand runners versus the American runners, Australian runners would train to run easy and loose. And they would do like maybe 1 or 2 hard workouts a week. Rob DiCostello, one of the greatest marathoners in history, his speed workout was 1 day a week. He ran 8 times a quarter. That was it. Now, Alberto would do that as a warm-up. And I don't know, it was just a different philosophy. Before the 84 Olympics, I set up a training camp for the Australian runners, a pre-Olympic training camp in the Bay Area, because they didn't want to, go to LA early and they wanted to keep training, blah, blah, blah. So they came to the Bay Area, Palo Alto. I lived adjacent to a forest where I would run every day. It was perfect because it was similar to where they had trained in Canberra, the Stromlo Forest in Canberra. I said, oh, this is a great place to run. It's all soft dirt trails. And oh, it's great. It's great. So I arranged for some of the local 29, 30-minute 10K guys, good guys, to run with the Australians so they wouldn't get lost. We'd start a run, and the local guys would be like a mile ahead. And we're like, where are those guys? Those guys are the greatest fans in the world. And it was different.
Yeah, that's great. Have you been down to where Rod Dixon lives now, Split Apple Rock? Have you been down to that north part of the South Island?
He lives in Nelson. He's from
No.
Nelson.
Yeah.
Nelson is the northern part of the South Island. His brother, John, was always his coach. But no, I've never been to Nelson. I've been all over the South Island, but I've never been to Rod's place. He lives, I think, at least half the year in LA.
Mm.
He's a
Uh,
terrific.
I've been in touch with him. He was staying at this kind of cool natural formation called Split Apple Rock. Paddling around there, if you look at the right angle, it looks like an apple split in half. Down the road from Nelson, 10 miles down. And so I missed him when I was there, but I'll cut all this garbage talk out. But
Rod, you think about a guy like Craig Virgin, who was good in high school, college, as a pro. He was good at every distance. Rod was great at 1,500, 5,000, 10,000. The marathon, the range he had was just amazing. He was an incredible runner. I would say he's underrated, but I don't think he comes immediately to mind the greatest runners in the world, but he was. He really was.
all right, let me ask you about then the timing and career part. People listening to this podcast, no doubt, have read your articles over
Mhm.
the years at Runner's World. What was the circumstances of you leaving Pennsylvania, going to Texas, and leaving Runner's World? You had another career in sports. It wasn't just Runner's World.
Yeah, I went to work for Mizuno. What happened was Amby and I had worked together for years and years. We had a very successful magazine. And then Rodale Press brought in a completely different team of people to run the company. And they brought in a new editor to Runner's World. Very nice guy by the name of David Willey. He and I didn't see eye to eye about anything. I got fired, which was fine. So I'd been coming to Austin for years, working on shoe reports in Austin and running races here. And I always wanted to live here. I didn't want to leave Runner's World. I'd been there 25 years and it was hard and it was hurtful, but I also didn't want to stay. And it just worked out really well because we lived in a small town in Pennsylvania and I have twin daughters and there wasn't a whole lot to do in this town. The town was really small and Pennsylvania was a little bit limiting. And we came to Austin and Austin has everything. It's just a great city and musically and athletically and culturally. And my kids thrived here. In retrospect, it was a great move for me. And I got a job working for Mizuno, which was terrific. I really enjoyed that, about 10 years.
Earlier, before you got with them, Carl Lewis was with them,
Mhm.
I think, at some points. And did you have a role or opinion, or what was going on with who they sponsored in the running world that you knew? Any overlap there?
Just a little. Mizuno made great track spikes in the mid 80s, like in the 84 Olympics. Even before then, like Santa Monica Track Club sprinters, Steve Lewis, all those guys, Carl Lewis, they all wore Mizuno spikes. I don't know how much they were getting paid. And there were other guys, Frankie Fredericks wore them, and they were renowned for their spikes. I wasn't working for Mizuno at the time, but Mizuno made great equipment. They were great in volleyball equipment, great golf equipment.
Yeah, golf name is big. Yeah.
I still use their clubs. And in running, I thought their shoes were terrific. They went through a big renaissance in I can't remember the year, but they came out with their whole plate technology. It was before I got there, but I didn't have much to do with who they signed or Ron Wayne. I don't know if Ron
Oh, yeah.
was a really good runner. He was in charge of all that. And I worked for Ron. And it was a really good experience for me. I loved the company. I loved their gear. It was awesome. I buy their shoes because they worked well for me. Yeah, it was awesome.
Oh, let's talk about the final off ramp of running. We've gone through these transitions. You're a positive guy. You're still competing. You've got your found your place to still compete in golf and you're swimming, but what was it that you knew racing was over for you? How do you handle
Well,
it?
it, it was pretty funny looking back on it. In 215 or 216, like the Houston Marathon, I don't know. I think the Houston Marathon is one of the best marathons in the world. It's just a great course, great logistics, great organization, just an awesome race. And
Pretty flat.
it's pretty flat, which I like. And the weather's usually good. It's in
January.
Yeah. And in 215, I ran really well. And I might have won my age group. I think I did win my age group, which was a big deal for me because in Texas, we have a statewide competition. And there was one guy whose name I don't remember, who was from Houston, who was really good in my age group. And I had never beaten him. I finally beat him in this race in the marathon. And so I thought, I'm going to train really hard for the next year. Probably be my last race anyway. But I didn't want to burn out or anything. Yeah, because I've been running forever. So I trained really hard all through the fall and everything. I was in great shape for Houston. And on my last long run, like a week before the race, I was like about 300 or 400 meters from where we were stopping, and I hit a crack in the sidewalk, and I went flying, and I broke 3 ribs and had a poor hernia. And I thought it's a sign from God. And so I didn't run, but I went out on a kind of a window, and I don't I don't miss racing much, but I miss like long runs with my friends, 20-mile runs and stuff like that, and meeting my friends and working out together. And I really miss that because I can't run 20 miles anymore. I don't miss racing all that much, but I do miss the camaraderie of being with the team and everything. I still see some of my friends, but some of them I just only saw it in running. It was great. And in Austin, the level of the people who run is just really remarkable. There's PhDs and professors and engineers and software engineers, and it's really great people. I miss that.
Yeah, I think you've put it well. A lot of people that have been part of teams anytime in these last 5 decades, part of a cross country team or track
Yes.
team, the relationships we formed
Yeah.
on runs and busing to meet.
Yeah.
A lot of us have friends that are still from our high school and university days that are
Yeah,
like
because,
friends.
because running is inherently an individual sport, and being part of a team gives you a sense of teamwork, even though there isn't really any teamwork like basketball or something like that. I don't know. I just loved every part about it. Austin has one of the greatest running communities of any place I've ever been. In America, they always talk about Boulder, but here we'd have 4 or 5 races every weekend. And we had so many choices. We had distance. We had a series of races building up to our marathon, and where they keep like age group standings, who's leading. And it was just really a terrific place to run. Still is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great city with a lot going for it, and it's not really that many people on the scale of big city.
You haven't been here in a while.
Yeah.
It's the 12th biggest city in America.
Is it? Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, yeah,
Yeah.
it's been a few years.
Yeah.
It's a very big pleasure to meet you, and thank you for spending time with us. We've all enjoyed your contributions to the sport as a journalist, your insights. I'm sure hours and hours could go more with your insights and some of your personal friendships that you're able to share. People are going to really enjoy listening to all this. Really appreciate your time today, Wish.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed talking to you.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed another episode. Do you have someone you'd like to hear interviewed on the podcast? You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel or on the website, running70s.com. That's running70s.com. Let me know what you think of the episodes and anyone, including yourself, you'd like to hear interviewed.
I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back. Bye.